Okay, we spent a little bit of time looking at the expansion itself, and what I want to do in this lecture is talk a little bit about the effects. So the effects in society, the effects on the economy, and so on. So we've got a couple of Roman historians, actually more than a couple, who a little bit later in this period start writing about what's happening. And one of the common themes throughout sort of Roman historiography that were written in the first century BC, first and second centuries AD, looking back, is the effects of greed on the Roman people and how greed leads to the decline of sort of Roman morals and so on. And so I've given you a quote here by Flores, and I've given you the dates when he was living. So numerous were the spoils coming from the wealthy nations that Rome was incapable of containing the fruits of its victories. And this is found in his epitome 1.18. What he's really talking about is so much wealth was coming into the Roman Empire, and Rome in particular, and of course the patrician class, that it led to more and more greed, which led to more and more issues, including the breakdown of Roman society, at least according to these Roman historians. Now, if you look at some of the social effects of this, so mostly what you have on this slide is really the Romans being affected by their takeover of Greece. So it's always kind of interesting to think about this. So we talked about in the last lecture how Rome comes in and takes over Greece after the Third Punic War. Technically, the Romans have taken over Greece, but what really happens is that Greek culture sort of takes over Rome for a bit. And so this list mostly deals with those type of issues. So you see art. That first slide I just showed you on this video was a slide that I had taken, and it shows some of these statues in the Roman Forum. This was something that was done primarily because of the effects of taking over Greece and Romans seeing what was going on in Greece. Now, of course, many of these statues too were taken from Greece and brought back to the Forum. We see architecture being affected. We see literature in particular being affected. As I put up here, you've got literature being written in Latin starting in this period, but it's really on Greek topics, and then it finally moves to Latin topics. I'll skip this Romanization here and I'll come back to it in a second, but you do have the religion where, and we talked about this before, how, through the Etruscan influence and their contacts with the Greeks, you've got similarities being injected into Roman religion. You also have, during this period, the Romans sort of wholesale taking over various native Greek religions in the process. They were very open to doing things like that. And the Romanization, what that's referring to is a sort of mass influx of Romans into all of these territories that they're taking over. And these are primarily colonists and or veterans of these particular wars. And the Scheidel article that I'm mentioning here is the one on human mobility in free populations. So you can go ahead and look at that on pages 22 to 24. You also have economic effects of this expansion. And what I've given you here are 6 sort of little points on how the Romans ended up doing their business. So you've got this Romoi, which are Roman businessmen who are now traveling all over. You've got them in Spain, North Africa, really essentially wherever the Romans had taken over. These are the businessmen. You've got this group called negotiatores. Now, you can see that from this word, this is where we get negotiator from. These are, as I put here, businessmen, traders, financiers. These are all sent out by the Romans to do business. Just before the Third Punic War, you've got really the Romans taking over a big part of the Aegean Sea, and part of that was on the island of Delos, which is very famous in Greek history. This was something called a free port, where business people could stop, unload their goods, load their goods, and so on. And this brought a lot of businesses in. And of course, we just talked about the fact that as Rome was expanding greatly, huge amounts of money are being brought back into Rome, and especially into the pockets of the patricians. And this is going to cause quite a few issues in Roman society, which we'll talk about in a few weeks. Now, when you've got a massive influx of new wealth, what that ends up doing is sort of devaluing the wealth that you already have. So you've got coins that have been minted by the Romans since the 300s, where it contains a certain percentage of, say, silver. Now, when you get a massive influx of new silver, like what they did with taking over Spain, the value of that coin actually goes down, which leads to inflation and so on. So not all, as I put here, were good. Another thing that was not good was you've got a massive increase in the number of slaves. So as the Romans are going through these areas and taking them over, the Roman troops capture people and then they sell them for money. And then these people make their way back, these slaves make their way back into Rome in particular. And massive influx of slaves now doing domestic and agricultural work that were normally done by the poorer class of Romans. So these poor Romans are being put out of a job by slaves, and it causes lots of societal issues as well. More on economic effects. So you've got all of these soldiers who are out fighting. So, you know, they're in North Africa, they're in Spain, they're in pushing into Northern Europe, they're into Greece, pushing into Persian-held territories. These soldiers have to leave their homes for sometimes years at a time. Now what happens is, and I just told you, slaves end up moving into these particular positions. And of course, when wars finish, the soldiers go back home, and then their jobs, their agricultural jobs, have essentially been taken over by slaves. So that causes some issues. Another issue which affects the economy is the fact that as they're gaining all of these new territories, they're bringing in different food from all these places. So for example, in North Africa, it's been widely referred to as the breadbasket for Rome, and this is certainly the case. So you've got Roman farmers in Italy who are growing wheat, and they cannot compare to the yields that are being grown in North Africa and what will later be grown in Egypt. So they are put out of business, these native Italian, native Roman people. Land values go down, crop values go down, and then they end up trying to plant other crops that I list here. You also have legislators trying to stop these patricians from being going from super wealthy to extremely wealthy. You've got a law called Lex Claudia, so Lex means law, in 218, where technically senators are not allowed to be involved in businesses because some thought it was a dirty job and they shouldn't be doing it. Now, this law said they couldn't do it, so on face value they didn't, but of course what they ended up doing is hiring people to run their businesses for them. So technically they weren't doing it, but they were certainly getting all the benefits of this. So they were living according to the law, but really going against it. And then finally, you've got all of this new wealth coming in, at least according to the Roman historians, and this is leading to greater divisions, as you might imagine, between the super wealthy now and the super poor, and of course you have a whole class of slaves. You've got all of these wars really being fought and being done on the backs of these poor Roman farmers. So we've talked about how they're away for a very long time. When they finally get to come home, there are no jobs for them to do. That causes more displacement because people will then have to move to where there is work, and that usually involves moving into the cities. Now, one way that the patricians handle this massive influx of wealth is by setting up these estates called latifundia. As if I hear massive estates, they're owned by the patricians, and because they couldn't really work in business, what they end up doing is putting their trusted slaves in control of this. And of course, when you've got land disappearing and being gobbled up by the patricians, when these Roman soldiers come home, their families aren't there and their land isn't there. So lots and lots of issues. And I'd mentioned this at the very beginning. You've got Roman historians writing about this, saying more greed, more wealth leads to more greed, which leads to a decline in Roman morality. And as I said, this is a fairly common feature in Roman writings and, of course, in the study of Roman historiography or the history of writing history.